The appalling damage of dropping the Michael Flynn case. It embeds into official U.S. policy a shockingly extremist view of law enforcement as the enemy of the American people. So I don't want to go too hard on this article, as it is an opinion piece by the New York Times. It's by two law professors, and it has to do with the recent motion to dismiss the Michael Flynn case. Let's read. Criminal law specialists and members of the law enforcement community are tough to really shock. But the Justice Department's announcement that it would drop criminal charges against Michael Flynn, President Trump's former national security advisor, has provoked, in addition to outrage, a sense of utter demoralization among them. They've never seen such a thing before. After all, Mr. Flynn twice pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. But it's important to understand why all Americans should be not just shocked, but outraged. It's not just because Mr. Flynn won't go to jail or offer any service towards justice. It's because this move embeds into official U.S. policy an extremist view of law enforcement as the enemy of the American people. It's a deception that Americans must see through, and that the federal judge overseeing Mr. Flynn's case, Ahmet Sullivan, can reject by examining the Justice Department's rationale in open court and by allowing a future Justice Department to reconsider charges. In 2017, when he pleaded guilty, Mr. Flynn apologized to the judge for lying to investigators, saying, quote, "I recognize the actions I acknowledge in court today were wrong, and through my faith in God, I am working to set things right." Now, like I said, this is an opinion piece, but I really feel as though this is a total misrepresentation of the case, and I really want to try to stick to the facts here. Let's delve into it. So the Michael Flynn case is just as complicated as it is old, and without sounding cheesy, to really understand it, you have to start at the beginning. So let's go back to 2016. In 2016, the FBI started an investigation into foreign and national diplomats and their potential ties to Russia. This was called Hurricane Crossfire. In August of 2016, the FBI turned their attention to Michael Flynn, then National Security Advisor to the Trump administration's campaign, under the name Crossfire Razor. Now, this investigation was predicated on three facts. One was his service as foreign policy advisor to the Trump administration. Two, his publicly documented affiliation to Russian state entities. And three, because he traveled to Russia in December of 2015. Now, after just 4 months of investigation, the FBI determined, quote, that Mr. Flynn was no longer a viable candidate as part of the larger Crossfire Hurricane umbrella case, and they prepared to close the investigation. Now, it's important to note here that this takes us into December of 2016, at which point Trump had already appointed Michael Flynn as his national security advisor for his incoming administration. It's also at this point that the FBI learns of communications between Michael Flynn and Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, whose conversations concern matters of foreign policy. The FBI now determines to reopen, or at least continue their investigation, under the pretext of the Logan Act, which is a law that has never been used that prohibits individuals from representing the United States in any matters of foreign policy. It's important to know that then FBI Director Comey did not want to notify the incoming Trump administration of the calls and the investigation into Michael Flynn, which was contrary to the position taken by then Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates and other senior officials at the Department of Justice. On January 24, 2017, Yates contacted Comey's office to demand that he let the incoming administration know about the calls. When he got back in touch with her later on that day, it was to tell her that agents were already on their way to the White House to interview Flynn. And what's especially interesting here is that they were going to interview Michael Flynn based on a conversation for which they already had the transcripts. So ask yourself why they're going to ask him questions about a conversation that they already knew the contents of. I think that's important. Now, Comey said in his testimony that it's because they wanted to figure out exactly the nature of the relationship between Kislyak and Flynn, but I really don't buy it. To me, it just seems like the FBI was trying to justify the last 4 months of investigation. They wanted to turn something up and be able to justify what they were doing, and they were looking to create a scandal, and they did. Let's also keep in mind that the FBI broke a couple of norms that day in pursuing this interview. First of all, they never notified the White House counsel or requested their presence at the interview with Michael Flynn. They also didn't coordinate this interview with the Department of Justice, for which senior justice officials, quote, hit the roof, and Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates was dumbfounded and flabbergasted at this fact. Now, I downloaded a PDF of the court documents, to which I'll leave a link in the description. According to the agents who interviewed Flynn, he seemed unguarded, and at no point was there a change in posture, tone, or eye contact, which would be indicative of lying. And ultimately, Flynn was charged with lying to the FBI that day. But what was the lie exactly? Really, the lie was that he didn't exactly remember his conversation with Kislyak, which I will drive this point home again. The FBI had the transcripts to the call. They knew what was said. I think it's obvious at this point to anybody with common sense that they were conducting this interview to get him to slip up and say something incorrect so that they could hold against him that he lied to the FBI. Also keep in mind that the FBI didn't record this interview because they never record interviews. They have their agents write out 302 forms, which is the name of the government form where they write the notes on for the interview. And the notes for this particular interview took 3 weeks to write after it was rewritten multiple times. Now, the court said in their move to dismiss the case that, quote, proof of a false statement to federal investigators under Section 1001 requires more than a lie. It also requires demonstrating that such a statement was material to the investigation. They continue, in the case of Mr. Flynn, the evidence shows his statements were not material to any viable counterintelligence investigation, or any investigation for that matter, initiated by the FBI. Indeed, the FBI itself had recognized that it lacked sufficient basis to sustain its initial counterintelligence investigation by seeking to close that very investigation without even an interview of Mr. Flynn. Having repeatedly found, quote, no derogatory information on Mr. Flynn, the FBI's draft closing communication made clear that the FBI had found no basis to predicate further investigative efforts into whether Mr. Flynn was being directed and controlled by a foreign power in a manner that threatened U.S. national security. Now, just bear with me now because I'm going to continue reading a little bit more of the court documents because I think they really summarize the reasons as to why this whole Flynn investigation was just a total farce in the first place. So the article continues. The court documents continue. With its counterintelligence investigations no longer justifiably predicated, the communications between Mr. Flynn and Mr. Kislyak, the FBI's sole basis for resurrecting the investigation on January 4, 2017, did not warrant either continuing that existing counterintelligence investigation or opening a new criminal investigation. The calls were entirely appropriate on their face. Mr. Flynn has never disputed that the calls were made. Indeed, Mr. Flynn, as the former Director of Defense Intelligence Agency, would have readily expected that the FBI had known of the calls. Mr. Flynn, as the incumbent National Security Advisor and senior member of the transition team, was reaching out to the Russian ambassador in that capacity. In the words of one senior DOJ official, quote, it seems logical that there may be some communications between an incoming administration and their foreign partners. Such calls are not uncommon when incumbent public officials preparing for their oncoming duties seek to begin and build relationships with soon-to-be counterparts. Nor was anything said on the calls themselves to indicate an inappropriate relationship between Mr. Flynn and a foreign power. Indeed, Mr. Flynn's request that Russia avoid escalating tensions in response to U.S. sanctions in an effort to mollify geopolitical tensions was consistent with him advocating for, not against, the interests of the United States. At bottom, the arm's-length communications gave no indication that Mr. Flynn was, quote, being directed and controlled by the Russian Federation, much less in a manner that threatened national security. They provided no factual basis for positing that Mr. Flynn had violated FARA, nor did the calls remotely transform Mr. Flynn into a viable candidate as part of the larger Crossfire Hurricane umbrella case. I know that was a lot to digest, but that was the words from the court themselves. Those are their conclusions. And I really think it drives home the point that the narrative being pushed by the mainstream, that Michael Flynn is some criminal that needs to be put to justice and that the only reason he's not going to jail is because he's a Trump crony, I think that's not really reflective of the reality on the ground. So let's summarize the court's findings, right? Basically, whether or not he lied, misremembered, or made false statements to the FBI, he wasn't under an actual investigation, so there's no charge to convict him of there. There was no crime committed. He misremembered a phone call for which the FBI already had the transcripts of. It doesn't even make sense to question him. He also wasn't doing anything at all out of the ordinary. He was coming into the new administration and he was contacting his foreign counterparts. That's part of his job, and that's all the FBI caught him doing, was doing his job. And they tried to tie it to some grander Russian conspiracy scandal, and it just didn't work. Anyway, if you have any doubts as to what the narrative is, I encourage you to read the actual transcripts here. Read the court documents. It's not that much to go through. And as always, come to your own conclusions. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was at least a little bit informative. If it was, make sure you like it, subscribe, and share it so we can get more thoughtful dialogue going. And as always, take care of yourselves.